Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and this is a program where we talk to people about communication and media work that they are doing, theoretical, practical, and if you like applied. We talk to academics, researchers, activists and journalists who are part of the all or part of the above. Today I'm delighted to welcome Bill Marx, who's the editor-in-chief of The Arts Views, and we're going to talk about the arts and culture in Boston and what it's like, how it works, how the journal that you edit works, and some of the questions to do with criticism of the arts. So welcome, Bill.
Thanks.
And thanks for being here. So I guess the first question is, well, what are the arts these days in this day and age? What are the arts?
I think, what are the arts? They're so broad and expansive, it's sort of hard to. I'll say what we do, what we cover on the Arts Views. That helps me, because it's such a broad idea. And that is, we do, generally I would say, the fine arts and a certain number of the popular arts, meaning we review, museum exhibitions, so we do visual arts. We do movie reviews. We do book reviews. We've also done video game reviews. So we're willing to sort of branch out into that. Right. So, I'd say fine arts, meaning books and visual arts museums, but also more popular arts as well.
Right. So really any creative practice, pretty much?
Just about, although it has to meet a certain professional threshold. Meaning we're not going to review somebody, out on the who's on the beach creating something out of the sand, right? Sandcastle. We're basically doing things that invite professional things that usually are charging money, that are inviting people to buy or to view a performance. Right. And traditionally, critics were invited in to get the word out and also to evaluate the quality of whatever, the performance or the book, and on a consumer guide level, like, should I buy this book or should I go see the show? But also to create what I would say or be part of a dialogue about what the art's value is. Critics are judges, and through judging and analyzing what they judge, they can get ideas about the arts and how it reflects society.
Yeah. Is it hard to find people who, and I don't know how you qualify them, but who are qualified?
Well, it's sort of interesting about how you qualify as a critic. In the old days, they used to take, back in the 19th century or part of the 20th century, somebody could be writing about doing stuff on flower shows, and somebody with a cigar would go up and say, "Hey, I need someone to review the theater, start reviewing the theater." And there's still some of that goes on, where non-specialists are sort of plugged into the hole to review something, and then they either do their best doing it or they get bounced and they're back doing, covering flowers a week later. Now, of course, with universities and the growth of universities, you have courses on arts criticism. I teach one at Boston University. So you have people who are being trained in writing arts criticism. So it can happen serendipitously. Someone can come in and say, "I'm really interested in music. I love hip hop. I want to write on hip hop," and the editor likes what they're doing and keeps them doing it. Or they can come out of a university and they have trained in arts criticism and say, "Well, I want to, I know how to do it. Give me a job. Put me in, coach, and I'll start writing." So it can happen either way. The more professionalization of it, the university aspect is more recent. I'd say that really began more in the 30s and the 40s. Then earlier on, where it just happened to be, if you're an enthusiast, you can start writing.
Yes, it's no longer the case, which means that there must be a level of quality about it that in a city like Boston with a lot of universities, you should think would be producing some good work.
Well, yeah, you get me started on that, but the idea is that you would have editors who would then select really good critics and then would stand by their critics, edit their critics, and so the work would be good. Yeah. The problem is, as ever with sort of journalism and newspapers, it's a mixed bag because newspapers want to make money. So often the idea of quality, which has to do with an honest evaluation, sometimes evaluations are not honest if the critic has not been carefully selected, or the editor, the editor could select it. They could be honest, but not quality. You could select a critic who likes everything. We currently have a lot of critics now that like a lot of stuff. Now, you could say, were they corrupt? I don't think they're being corrupt. I don't think they're being paid off. But I think they just happen to see a lot of things that they like, and they like a lot of it.
Right.
So there is, the idea of quality in criticism exists. I would argue that you have to go to the definition of criticism. And what is criticism? Arts criticism. And arts criticism is judgment with explanation. It's a verdict in which you then supply the why. How did you get to that verdict about a show or that book? Then the reader can be informed, stimulated, provoked, or disgusted by, the reasoning, of the critic. So insofar as that critics actually have reasons to back up what they're doing, then I would say they're writing criticism. But I would say that a lot of what's going on online, in Twitter or Yelp or Amazon, is not criticism. It's called criticism. It's said, are you going to write a review of this or that? But my argument would be that it's not really a review. It's what I call opinion. Because it often doesn't have a reasoned explanation for how you got to that conclusion, or the reasoning is not reasoning. It can be, well, I really like the color red, so because I really like the color red, I really like this restaurant and its food because all the walls are red. So I'm just going to love this. Well, that's a reason, I guess, but basically it's so impressionistic and personal. It's an opinion. So quality criticism, and you see it in some newspapers and magazines, and then in others you don't see it, has to have that element of explanation, of analysis, so you can evaluate the critic, and you can also learn something from the review, and how they came to that came to that verdict.
Which means that the users of your site, or the users of a critic, have to trust that person, right? They have to sort of have, it's almost like there's a relationship, right?
You should build up a relationship. It's harder and harder to do that. I mean, in the old days, you had a certain number, I keep saying the old days, but let's say back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there were major newspapers and magazines, and they had their critics, right? So I love James Agee. He's a great American film critic, probably one of the first great ones. He wrote for Time magazine. So people would follow him in Time magazine every week, and they would learn his voice, and yes, they would learn to trust him. Online becomes difficult because there are fewer centralized sources of information for arts criticism and reviewing. There are a zillion blogs. There are people get a lot of their reviews, quote unquote, I would say opinions, from Facebook. I mean, who do you trust? Well, increasingly my students at BU, they don't really trust critics. Their idea of trust is trusting their friends. So criticism tends to come more from Facebook because they go in groups saying, well, I saw this movie, and all my Facebook friends are just going to love this film, and I'm just going to tell them to see it. That's where trust comes from. The old trust came from the newspapers. If someone writes for the New York Times, or if someone writes for Time magazine, they must be, they're a trustworthy, thoughtful, expert critic. That is one of the things that, in terms of arts criticism, has sort of gone by the wayside in this increasingly, the maelstrom, the melee, the tidal waves of reviews, and I would say opinions that are just floating out there.
Yeah, there are a few people around. You mentioned Agee years ago. The equivalent, I guess, in the fine arts field would be Robert Hughes, the Australian. And people would read him every week in Time magazine, knowing they were going to get either something really strong in opposition to something, but it was always well grounded in his knowledge.
He's a terrific, I agree with you, he was a terrific critic.
Yes.
And that gives you the idea about quality. I would argue that even though Time, I can't even tell you if the Time currently has a visual arts critic, a lot of them have just gotten rid of them. They're simply not of the same quality. The editors and the magazines simply don't want to spend the money or spend the time or have someone like Hughes who's writing. You read his reviews now, right? That he was writing for Time magazine in the 60s and the 70s. You would not find that in the Time magazine or in the Newsweek of today. The assumption about the audience, the intelligence of the audience, the interest of the audience has waned as reviews have become shorter, and it's more about cutting to the chase and more sort of patronizing the readers. We just want to know whether this is worth going to see anyway. So it's not they are critics insofar as that they're called critics and they're in Time magazine. Whether they're writing criticism or not. I mean, you mentioned about journalism and activists early, and I'm a bit of an activist journalist to the extent that I do draw a pretty controversial line here by saying one can be called a critic but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing criticism.
Right.
Hughes was doing criticism.
Yeah.
I would say what a lot of people are doing in Time magazine now is closer to opinion, because, and it's not necessarily their fault. They may be as smart as Hughes, but they're not given the amount of space
Yes.
and the assumptions of an intelligent readership.
That's true. And the other thing that comes to mind as a student of journalism and communication and as a scholar in the field is that you have the rise of public relations, and a lot of work that, a lot of things that appear to be, as you say, under the guise of criticism, are really the extension of a series of press releases and a marketing campaign that ends up appearing as a piece of critical work, which is the result of a great deal of money being spent.
Well, a great American novelist, William Dean Howells, was also a wonderful critic, and he was the editor of the Atlantic Monthly and lived in Cambridge. Anyway, he wrote back in the turn of the century, complaining already that
really?
all the really smart writers are going to advertising, because that's where the money is. We need them to be critics, but they all want the big money. And two, this has got to be like 1906, 07 was already saying, and the language of criticism is being invaded by, diluted by the language of advertising. And I would argue that process has continued after Howells in 06, 07, and has only accelerated now, where more and more people essentially think reviewing or criticism or even your opinion has to be phrased in what sounds like marketing language rather than actual idiosyncratic, eccentric, personal language in which you really talk about why you like something or why you don't like something.
And it's not mediated by a public relations expert or necessarily by the market. In fact, one of the things that I find quite fascinating, and this isn't necessarily about Boston, but we'll get back to Boston in a minute, is the power of the critics in New York City in relation to Broadway. If they say something doesn't work as a show, it'll be finished, won't it? I mean, that's really seems to me to be a good measure.
In a way, that's the end of what it used to be. In the old days, first off, saying the old days, but there was a time in New York City had a number of newspapers that were equal standing. And so when someone was reviewing a Broadway show, you'd have 6 or 7 newspapers, all of which would had, visible critics. So there was a real fight going on, you know what I mean?
Interesting.
Now, as newspapers began to die or die off, or their authority waned, now you have the New York Times, which zealously fights to keep the power of its critics, right? And particularly over Broadway, particularly over theater.
Interesting.
And so they really fight for it, and that is sort of like the end of something. I mean, in Boston, there was a time when I first came in the 80s, when Kevin Kelly, who was then the theater critic of the Boston Globe, could kill a show. He couldn't kill a Broadway show that was sort of trying out and going down to New York, but he could definitely, sort of more medium-sized theaters, he could go in and say, this show's terrible, and the show would close. That no longer holds. The Globe no longer has that power to kill anything, to destroy a show. And I doubt there are only a handful of newspapers in the country that have that sort of power. I mean, that influence has dissipated because of the explosion of opinion, right? The lack of authority in the number of newspapers and magazines and the people who read them and take them carefully in terms of their critical power.
So is this a space, the death of many newspapers, if not all of them, is this a space that your enterprise is filling?
That's why I started the Arts Views. I started the Arts Views because I saw what was happening to the arts section of the Boston Globe and throughout the country. That critics were being cut, laid off. They weren't given enough space, meaning the column inches, to be able to do the criticism that they should be able to do. In other words, you need a certain number of words to be able to not only render an opinion, but also back it up with reasons. Well, you can't do that in a tweet, and you can't do it in 100 words. You need more. So newspapers were canning critics, and my feeling is that how can we take the best of the traditional arts criticism, meaning enough words. I say around 1,000 words. That's what George Orwell says in his Confessions. Confessions of a Book Reviewer, a wonderful essay about being reviewed. So you need at least about 1,000 words to be able to, to summarize the book, and then to be able to say what you think, and then give reasons for how you came to that conclusion. So around 1,000 words. So why not do it online? And so the Arts Views was an attempt to take what used to work and what I thought was really in terms of quality criticism, and put it on the web. And the thing about the web is that it's a perfect home for it. I mean, for those who want serious talk, serious conversation about the arts, then why, you know what I mean? Just because newspapers are dying doesn't mean that criticism has to die. It simply needs to be brought into, you know, what can say the new millennium, the new technological world, and you're not going to make the same sort of money, and perhaps have the same sort of cachet that you had in the old days. You say the New York Times can close the show. I would like to think the Arts Views could close the show, but I doubt it. You know, but we can become part of the dialogue, part of the way people think about the arts, and I can tell you from getting emails from arts institutions large and small, they are dying for criticism.
Is that right?
They want.
Well, it adds significantly, doesn't it? I mean, it adds significantly if you're talking to somebody. It's like a conversation. You want them to talk back, just like we're doing now. And if you perform, you want someone to say, "Well, this is how I, sitting in the audience, saw this performance."
We're
this
not
is
so
what's
far
good
gone that artists and performers simply just don't want to get a paycheck. You know, they want to know what their impact is like on the audience and also on informed members of the audience. This is what a critic should be. And I agree, it's that sort of dialogue. And also dialogue among other critics, you know what I mean? So that you can get a nice, you know, because I don't really, at the Arts Views, I love it when critics disagree. You know, I love a little friction because we're not all one person and one taste. The idea is that we want a dialogue. We want different people to have a different point of view. But from all those points of view, I get to hear, hopefully the critic tells me, well, how did you come to that conclusion? What can I learn from that? How does that challenge the way that how did that challenge the way that I saw that particular movie?
Well, it also brings to mind a much larger question about the role of culture and the role of cultural production, which is its contribution to public discourse about what ideas are valuable and how ideas are worked out in public.
I agree.
It's really central to what a civilization can be.
But that's what criticism asserts. You know, to me, the idea of criticism, if you, you know, I said it is a judgment with analysis, and the overall value of that is that it is an articulation of the meaning and the value of the arts in our lives. That unless we have that sort of, I'm not saying critics are the only ones who supply that kind of dialogue. There are other people, but critics are uniquely situated through the act of judgment to be able to talk about, raise issues of the meaning and value of the arts in our lives. That when you destroy that way of thinking and talking about the arts, and we've already referred to some of the, you know, public relations and other forces that are trying to destroy that, right? Then the value of the arts themselves suffer. You know, and also, I mean, just something that's been on my mind lately is that we are, you know, anti-intellectualism is practically a religion, you know, a civil religion in America. And another foe of criticism, which is why it's not in newspapers and magazines and why it's dying in many ways, is that if you're going to have a judgment and if you're going to give reason for it, that is an intellectual act. It can be a passionate act. I mean, it can be an angry act. It can be a frustrated act, disgusted act. But it is an intellectual act. And in a culture which simply is obsessed with consumption and turning us all into customers and aren't really, you know what I mean? As long as the customer is satisfied with the product, doesn't want any more thought about that, then criticism becomes, you know, a problem.
No, I think it's a very well made point and an important point to keep in mind as to the kind of work that you're doing. What does the cultural and artistic environment in Boston like, as you see it now, and maybe making a bit of a contrast with how you've seen it change over the years?
I mean, it's always hard, those broad questions. I'll just give you a broad answer. I would say that just overall, there's more activity than ever before. Certainly when we're talking about theater, and I've been a theater critic for many years, so I tend to think of theater first off. I'd say there are more theaters than ever before, more activity than ever before, more professionalism than ever before. So in that way, things are looking up, meaning in terms of the quantity and the professionalism. But I would say, as a critic, I would say that even though we're having all this happening, the ideas of marketing and public relations has insidiously, you know, placed itself within the art that's being created and the art that's selected to be being shown. Meaning, when I for what my feeling of art, and this gets to the idea of what art is about, or what is I think art should challenge and provoke, not simply please and entertain. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think art needs to shock us, awaken us, to take us out of our daily lives for a moment into another realm. And I see less of that because I feel that what's happening in the arts in Boston is a general sense that we're struggling to survive with more and more competition. That means the pie, which isn't necessarily getting that much bigger in terms of the arts consumers and audience members. I mean, I just went to a recent talk that I don't know if I can say that the stat's absolutely accurate, but was said that attendance at Boston performances, dance, plays, museums, in other words, people have to go out, is down by about 20%. Over the past few years. Right? It is going down.
Wow.
So how do you react to that? My reaction as a critic would say, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, do things that are provocative and challenging because that will bring people in. But what really people are doing the opposite, which is how can we do things that are safe and that are pleasurable and entertaining? And entertaining is a big word now. I mean, you will see the word arts and culture begin to atrophy. You're beginning to ready to see that because that has connotations of elitism, of not being inclusive enough. Words that will be suggesting more that the arts are fun, supply happiness, supply connection, are sort of family oriented. They make they give they invest your own creativity with emotional satisfaction. Right? You're going to be seeing more of that as artistic producers panic more and more and want to create the kind of art that it's going to bring an audience in.
Right. Doesn't say too much about the audience, or the city does it really, but I suspect all cities, or many cities, if not all of them, are.
I'm not just blaming Boston, and I don't want to blame the audience. I mean, if I'm looking for an ultimate, our good old anti-intellectualism is always there to be. I'm always ready to flog that.
Yeah.
But I also think that I would blame our educational system. When I was a youngin', we had art in the schools. I took a class in visual arts. We had music. I mean, it was part of our lives from the very beginning. And we were familiar with it, and so the idea of going to the symphony or going to the theater or going to the museum when I was in grammar school, was it was taken for granted. Of course, it would be an interesting thing to do. I was curious about it at the very least. Now, there's not arts education is atrophied. There's not as much education in arts, and when you look at what's around on the net or what's on TV, what our kids are given to deal, what their entertainment, their luxury hours, or their off time is filled with, and it's filled with video games. Nothing wrong with that, and video games are sort of interesting, but anything but the fine arts. If you look on cable TV, for example, on the news programming, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or CNN or you fill in the blank, there's very little about the arts.
Yeah, that's very true.
Very, very little. Well, if you don't see anything about the arts, if you're not exposed to the arts, if no one's talking about the arts, then guess what? The arts disappear.
Well, maybe they're going to go the way of the dinosaur and be replaced by something that is no longer called the arts and no longer has that kind of character.
Yeah, no. I think we may. I've called it the uniculture, meaning when Shakespeare and rappers are all the same, right? It's all the same deal. Then that's a uniculture, meaning there's no aesthetic discrimination. It all becomes a form of entertainment, and you like Shakespeare, and I like Beyonce. Live and let live.
But maybe in my case, I would like Beyonce and Shakespeare in the one person. I think that's really the way that postmodernity is going.
I'm loving it, except I guess I'm not post enough to think that Beyonce and Shakespeare are exactly the same things, and that they have the same value.
Well, I didn't say that, but I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
But I know you didn't say it, but what you're saying there is, postmodernity is this sort of inclusive. Everything is inclusive. I've got no problem. I like Beyonce. It's fine by me. But it's when I ask my students, well, is there a difference between Beyonce and Shakespeare, do you think? And they'll go, no. It's all what turns you on.
Really? Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. So that's the sort of shift, I think, in the culture too, isn't it? The immediacy of some kind of stimulation. that happens right now, whether or not it's within that realm of quality or criticism or critique that we might think of as the arts embodying, the shift in the register of what happens in creative activity is that it's sort of instantaneous and it happens now, and then you move on quickly to the next thing.
Yeah, and you get out of it whatever you get out of it. And it tends to be pleasure. Again, the anti-intellectualism, it tends to be the idea that art is not there to provoke or make you think. If it makes you think, then that's difficult and that's bad.
Yes.
But so it's there of ease of access. And that, I think, I would connect with your idea of stimulation. The idea of stimulation is connected with the ease of how easy it is to get it.
Yes.
So that if it get on the iPhone, right, and you can watch it on the iPhone, then it's going to be the ease of access and the stimulation is going to be much stronger and valuable than Shakespeare. I mean, if you ever watched Shakespeare on an iPhone, I mean, I think generations to come, they will probably get into it, but for me, I find it completely frustrating.
Yes, and I think it's a good indicator of the challenges that producers and writers and creative people have to face up to, that something that you can put on an iPhone that gives you pleasure, or that gives users pleasure, is really what is the dominant cultural form, but it's not the only form. And I would say that maybe that's the point around which you and I might differ, in terms of saying, well, it's very good, it's better to go to an amphitheatre and watch a performance of Shakespeare as opposed to watch it at a cinema.
Well,
you know, taken up by Baz Luhrmann, let's say, making.
I mean, look, I don't mind Baz Luhrmann. I mean, don't make me too much of a dinosaur. I'm simply saying that I would. Well, then I would argue you want both, but you definitely would want to experience Shakespeare in a theater, as you know, because he wrote it for live performance, and there is that. I hate words like magic, but there is that intensity and that experience that you should have. But the price point, you know, and now we're getting economics. I mean, in the future, as these big screens become bigger and bigger, and you know, and the more you know, I mean, essentially more realistic, as the images become sharper and clearer and better, then I can easily see people wanting. You know, right now I can subscribe to a service in which I can watch the Royal Shakespeare Company doing King Lear. And I can watch it on my screen. It's about $10 a month.
Really?
You know, I can, and so that, and to me, I mean, and I love it in one way, you know, but I see the danger. What's going to happen is that people are simply not going to be seeing Shakespeare on stage. It'll be too expensive, prohibitive. Why go out? You know, I mean, it's a, you know, and they will stay at home and watch it on the big screen.
And there's something about being in a room with other people watching theatre that's just purely unique, isn't it?
Well,
you
that's
just
what
can't
the
replicate
Greeks. That's how theater started, right? They brought the people together. They didn't bring women in, but anyway, they brought the people together. And the idea is that it was part of the public debate of issues to look at theater and then talk about it. I mean, that's where theater comes out of. Was that very powerful political impulse? Instead, what we have again economically with, you know, the idea of technology and capitalism is atomization. Everybody in their living room watching their screen. And you get the Netflix for theater. You're going to have a sort of Amazon service for you know, already have it somewhat for books, where you just sort of download what you want, get it when you want, at a price that you want, and it's all about you, and not about the idea of the arts creating or generating a sense of dialogue or community.
Great. Well, Bill, thank you very much. That's a kind of a low and then a high point to end on. So thank you very much for your contribution. And thanks to you for all your efforts in working on the Arts Fuse. And people can check it out at theartsfuse.com, right?
It's at theartfuse.com. Also theartfuse.org, either one.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's all from me, Marcus Breen, and from Boston Media Theory. Until next time, good night and see you later.
Hey, Mom. I got the job.
You've got the job. Welcome aboard.
I've got a job to do today.
Have a good first day at work, Mom.
Donate to Goodwill. Help provide job training in your community.